Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. I am really excited today because we're going to jump headfirst into some source material that is just incredibly profound, deeply personal, and honestly, sometimes delightfully bizarre.
Yeah, this is a big one. Today we're doing a deep analysis, really getting into the foundations of, well, a lot of modern channeling and even spiritual psychology concepts. Our source is Session 17 from the early sessions, Book 1 of the Seth Material. This was recorded way back on January 20th, 1964.
And it's an absolute goldmine. I mean, the transcript is from a 3-hour session. It feels less like a channeled lecture and more like you're eavesdropping on this private, really intense psychological deep dive delivered by this cosmic entity who's, incredibly insightful, but also gets a bit exasperated sometimes.
He definitely does.
We actually got instructions to keep this deep dive feeling relaxed, maybe a bit chilling in parts, but also funny. And Seth, remarkably, he delivers. He mixes this really heavy personal truth with these unexpected flashes of humor.
Absolutely. And just to set the scene, the session was delivered by Jane Roberts, she's referred to as Ruburt, in the material channeling Seth. And she's speaking to her husband, Joseph, who's also Robert Butts. The original notes Joseph took are fascinating in themselves.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, he details how the actual mechanics of the channeling were shifting right around this time. Jane apparently stopped sort of hearing the words internally before she spoke them. That just came out. And her voice itself changed. It got noticeably louder, deeper, and sharper.
Wow. Okay, so our mission today, let's get focused. We are digging into Seth's multi-layered advice here. It covers everything from, believe it or not, post-death planes of existence to the function of the human ego, which is crucial but also easily sabotaged. And then there's this really chilling part, an explanation of how your own inner emotional state, especially if it's chaotic, can literally physically impact the reality and the health of people around you and even your pets.
It's a powerful concept. And maybe before we dive right in, just a quick note. This deep dive is being distributed completely free of charge on all major platforms. It's for educational purposes, and it's all made possible by the Seth Material and the publisher, New Awareness Network.
Right. Okay, Section 1. Let's start with maybe the lighter side. We really have to kick off with this surreal, kind of funny introduction that opens the whole session. Seth just immediately jumps in, addressing what sounds like an inside joke between him and Joseph. He says, "I'll go along with your little joke about Malva-toast in the midplane."
Yeah, it just lands right away, doesn't it? It shows his personality. He's responsive, sometimes got this dry wit, but also you can feel his impatience with maybe the more trivial stuff. He confirms Joseph's phrase Malva-toast was an apt description, which is funny in itself.
Apt for what?
Well, he then explains, very briefly, who she was. Actually, Malva herself was a not-too-intelligent woman who died in 1946 in South Dakota, as she said.
Okay, wait. Not too intelligent. Died in 1946. This immediately throws us into this whole concept of the midplane or semiplane. If we're talking about existence after death, what is this midplane? And why is it populated by not too intelligent people or fragments?
Right, that's the first big conceptual hurdle. Seth describes this midplane as a very specific sort of intermediate stage of development. It's definitely not heaven, definitely not hell. Think of it more like a transitional zone, a waiting room almost.
A waiting room?
Yeah. He says it holds a conglomeration of fragments at all stages of development, but the key thing is these personalities haven't yet gained sufficient knowledge or manipulability to progress further. They're kind of stuck.
So they're like spiritual teenagers, maybe? Like they haven't really excelled, but they haven't totally failed either. They're just kind of coasting.
That's actually a pretty good way to put it. Seth says they're on an only fair level of achievement. They're still working out problems they couldn't sort out during their physical life, but they're doing it in a rather dissociated fashion.
Dissociated? Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning they haven't really generated the focused energy or the insight needed to, fully commit to whatever their next true plane of existence should be. They're sort of caught in this cloud of unresolved stuff, hence the dissociated fashion. They're not fully engaged in their own progress.
Okay, but if this plane is full of souls who, as Seth puts it, err through ignorance, why would Seth even bother talking about Malva-toast? Isn't getting information from a place like that potentially misleading for Joseph and Jane?
That's a really crucial point, and Seth addresses it straight away. He gives this important warning. Information coming from the midplane might be excellent, but it can also be less than trustworthy at times. And the reason is simple. Their achievement level is not high.
So they're not lying on purpose.
No, not malicious. They just don't have the big picture. They lack that panoramic perspective. So they make mistakes through oversight just by not knowing everything. When Seth validates Malba, he's not really validating the accuracy of anything she might say. He's validating Joseph's intuition, his ability to sense that something was there, that this contact was made.
Gotcha. And his final comment on Malba before he moves on, it's just pure Seth, isn't it? That sort of cosmic passive aggression.
Oh, absolutely. He says, I would say crusty old Malba, but she is not even toasty. It's basically his way of saying, okay, you poked around, you found a fragment, fine. Now let's get back to the stuff that actually matters.
And moving on is exactly what he wants to do, because apparently Joseph was just bombarding him with questions at this point, right?
Oh, yeah. Joseph, the rational artist mind, was treating Seth like a cosmic Google. Seth says his mind was filled with ponderous questions like an endless chasm filled to the brim with heavy rocks. Joseph was throwing weird projectiles with vibrant force, questions about everything. Dreams, flying saucers, visions, other planes, planets, what happened to old radio stars. Just total information overload.
Which leads us to that amazing kind of self-deprecating line from Seth that really sets the theme for the whole rest of the session.
It's the perfect pivot. He basically just cuts through all the external stuff and redirects them inward. He complains, "You'd think surely that my first name was Encyclopedia." Then he delivers the punchline. "Just call me Psych for short and spell it P-S-Y-C-H.
P-S-Y-C-H.
Wow. That one line is basically the mission statement for the whole session, isn't it? He's saying, stop focusing on all this external trivia, all these facts and figures about the universe, and start focusing on the psychological tools you actually have right here, right now, inside yourselves.
Okay, section 2. That pivot towards the psychological. It happens fast, and it gets intense immediately. Seth connects Joseph's recent physical illness directly to his inner state, specifically linked to his identity as an artist.
Absolutely. No messing around. The illness, which sounds like it was probably stress-induced, maybe psychosomatic, Seth traces it right back to Joseph's psychic state of nervousness, fear, lack of confidence, and lack of focus as far as utilizing your artistic abilities were concerned.
So his creative anxieties were making him sick.
Essentially, yes. Seth says this state built up like many encircling walls. It basically formed a dam, blocking the flow of his own subconscious vitality, his creative energy.
And this really sets up this crucial, very nuanced discussion about the ego. Because, in a lot of spiritual circles, the ego gets a really bad rap. It's seen as the enemy. But Seth insists it's essential.
He's incredibly clear on this. The ego is extremely important. It's not something to be destroyed or ignored. It's the indispensable tool we need to navigate physical reality. It's the focusing mechanism, like a lens, by which the hidden self manipulates in the physical universe.
So for Joseph, the artist, the ego is what takes those raw creative impulses from inside and focuses them into something tangible, something effective on a canvas.
Exactly. It provides structure, focus, the ability to execute. But, and this is the critical part, the relationship between that inner self, the subconscious, and the ego tool is where things can go wrong.
Oh, so?
The moment the ego gets tangled up with fears, becomes involved with fears, even just mildly, that functional relationship just breaks down. And that's when Seth uses that incredibly powerful, really unforgettable analogy.
Hammer.
The hammer. The ego ceases to be an effective tool and becomes instead a hammer hitting you incessantly over the head. Instead of helping you build, it just starts bashing you. It becomes this internal instrument of self-destruction.
Okay, let's dig into the mechanics of that self-sabotage a bit more. How does the ego, which Seth calls just the topmost portion, manage to hijack the immense power of the subconscious, the greater part of the self?
Right. Seth is very clear. The subconscious is the engine room. It's the fountain of your individuality and personality. The ego is just the surface layer of this huge pool of energy. The natural state is for the subconscious to be constructive, to use the ego as its interface with, 3D reality.
Right.
But when the ego gets gripped by external worries, by practical fears like Joseph, worrying about money or critics, or whether his art will sell, it basically sends a signal, it conditions the entire system towards a negative output. It sets the whole inner factory to fear mode.
And this is where we get that really chilling phrase, thickly dimensioned pseudo-realities of pain. That sounds intense. What are those, and how does the ego force the subconscious to create them?
This is maybe the core teaching of this whole section. Fear isn't just a feeling in this model, it's energy. And the subconscious, because its fundamental nature is creative, has to do something with that energy. It has to materialize it somehow.
So if the ego is constantly focused on fear, like I'm going to fail, I'll be broke, this illness will never go away, it's basically feeding the subconscious a negative blueprint for creation.
Exactly. It's providing the instructions. And those creative energies, which should be flowing into constructive things like art or problem solving, get blocked. They build up, becoming these potent energy constructs, these thickly dimensioned pseudo-realities of pain.
So they're like energy patterns, patterns of panic, of distress that exist just under the surface of physical reality.
That's a good way to think about it. They're so potent, so focused by that fear-driven ego that they actually play about the physical body. They hover around you energetically, sometimes breaking through and manifesting as actual illness or chronic anxiety or that feeling of physical tightness and constriction.
Wow.
Seth says the ego, when it's driven by worry, is literally stealing the powers of the subconscious mind from their natural constructive tasks to do so. It's causing this massive internal energy disruption. It forces the self to build its own prison walls.
Which brings us back to the practical advice, what Seth calls the need for a light touch.
Yes, because the whole point of this really intense analysis, even though it sounds heavy, is actually liberation. Seth tells Joseph straight up, the ego must sit lightly, otherwise it can smother the talent that lies beneath.
Sit lightly.
Yeah. He even acknowledges that Seth, sometimes speaks heavy-handedly, like with the hammer analogy, but that's just to break through those really ingrained fears. The goal for the individual isn't to get rid of the ego, but to use it lightly, not let it become the tyrannical boss. It's like, you need the program to run, but you don't want it hogging all the system resources.
Yeah.
You want the operating system, the subconscious, to run the show efficiently.
Okay, section 3. So if the ego has become this fear-clogged hammer, the practical solution Seth offers is dissociation. Now, that word dissociation often has these, clinical, maybe negative connotations today, like detachment or mental splitting, ignoring your problems. How is Seth using it differently here?
That's a really important distinction to make. He's definitely not advocating for, clinical dissociation or just escapism. For Seth, dissociation is a practical, almost mechanical process. It's about unclogging the tool.
Unclogging it, how?
By consciously stepping the ego back from being the dominant, fear-based manager. It's about letting the creative aspects of the personality, the subconscious, get back in the driver's seat. So, paradoxically, it's actually about achieving a stronger unity with your creative inner self, not splitting off from it.
So it's about restoring the proper hierarchy. The subconscious is the architect, the builder, and the ego is the foreman who takes direction from the builder, not the other way around.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And Seth promises that the freely working subconscious, or the inner you, is completely capable of taking care of all practical considerations and will use the ego as a tool to see that this is done. He even points out that Ruburt Jane already understood this intuitively when she suggested they take a trip earlier. That was just the easiest method she knew for achieving this kind of psychological reset, this dissociation.
Okay, so beyond just understanding the concept, what specific practical things did Seth actually tell Joseph to do to make this shift happen?
He gave him 3 main pillars of practice, really concrete things. First, yoga and breathing exercises. These were strongly suggested.
Why yoga specifically?
Because in this view, the body and mind are totally interconnected. The exercises weren't just for, physical fitness. They were meant to physically help Joseph manage the energy dynamics involved, both for his own well-being and to help with the channeling sessions and any future psychic experiments they might do. It's about physical and energetic alignment.
Okay. Pillar 2 was autosuggestion. But Seth warns Joseph he'd tried this before and failed because he was too ego-bound. What does that mean?
Yeah, Seth uses this great analogy. He says Joseph was trying to use autosuggestion while being muscle-bound, like trying to lift weights when your muscles are already completely tense and rigid. You can't do it effectively.
So he was trying too hard.
Exactly. He was approaching it from the ego, trying to bully or command the subconscious into changing. That's a fear-based, controlling approach. Seth's instruction was crucial. Only use autosuggestion when you're in a drowsy state, right before sleep or just waking up, when the ego's grip naturally loosens. And the key is to suggest gently, like you're talking to a friend, not issue commands.
Suggest, don't command. Got it. And the third practical step was something they both already connected with. Nature.
Right. Seth points out that their shared love of nature is in itself a natural, effortless form of this kind of beneficial dissociation. Spending time in nature automatically reconnects the inner self with a reality that isn't built on human fears and anxieties. It lets the energy flow freely and constructively again. It provides that essential break from those pseudo-realities of pain we talked about.
Okay, now we have to tackle this really deep psychological layer Seth brings in, the Denmark incident.
Hmm.
This is a huge claim, right? He's basically saying that Joseph's really admirable, super disciplined work ethic now is actually a kind of reaction, a debilitating fear response, stemming from a past life he doesn't even consciously remember.
It is a massive claim, absolutely. But it's central to Seth's whole analysis of Joseph's current blocks. Seth reveals that, apparently, in a past life, which he just labels the Denmark incident, Joseph was, quote, a fleshpot.
A fleshpot,
Meaning someone overly indulgent, maybe lacking discipline, maybe driven by impulses without control. Seth suggests that because Joseph felt he betrayed himself through lack of impulse control in that life, he swung completely the other way in this life. He overcompensated dramatically, holding himself in these incredibly tight bonds, terrified of his own rich, natural impulses.
So his current rigidity, his almost excessive discipline, it's forged from a fear based on a memory of past failure he doesn't even consciously have.
Yeah, that's exactly how Seth presents it. He's afraid to give his impulses any freedom now because, deep down, unconsciously, he fears they'll lead him back to chaos or maybe even deceit. And this is why Seth's core instruction here is so radical and potentially transformative for Joseph. He says, now I beg of you to give them more rein.
Give the impulses more rein.
Yeah, instead of saying, look, you've built the discipline now. You have the structure. You don't need to keep reinforcing it with steel bars. This current self-imprisonment, this fear of freedom, is precisely why Joseph is hoarding time by being afraid of shortage. He's trying to control time, control his output, but it's actually strangling his creative lifeblood. Seth insists that only the strong freedom of your subconscious drives can truly let him experience the fullness and expansion of each moment.
Wow. That's a lot to unpack from one past life reference.
It really is. It reframes his entire personality structure.
Okay, section 4. This is where, as we mentioned, the session takes a really serious, quite personal, and honestly kind of chilling turn. Joseph and Jane had recently lost their dog, Misha, and also 2 cats. And Joseph directly asks Seth, why did this happen? Why did they all die relatively close together?
And this section, I think, contains one of the most difficult but also most profound lessons in the entire Seth material regarding personal responsibility for your inner state. Seth's answer is completely unequivocal. It's brutal, almost, in its honesty. He says, the fact is that the animals caught your emotional contagion.
Emotional contagion. They literally absorbed the toxic emotional atmosphere in the house.
That's precisely it. Seth describes the couple's psychic environment at that time as being destructive, short-circuited, and filled with inner panics. He explains that what he calls lesser dependent lives, especially household pets, rely quite heavily on the psychic strength and stability of the humans around them to reinforce their own energy, their own health.
So animals have their own vitality, but they're also deeply tuned into their caretakers.
Very much so, according to Seth. And during that period of acute psychological crisis for Jane and Joseph, remember, their own creative energies were clogged by fear. The ego was hammering away. They quite unwittingly withdrew that vital, strong reinforcement that the animals needed.
They didn't have the spare psychic energy to give.
Effectively, yes. And that lack of reinforcement then allowed underlying vulnerabilities in the animals to surface and take hold. In the case of the cats, Seth mentions they had some kind of inherited illness, maybe a virus. They had managed to keep the first cat going for a while, but their own inner turmoil drained the psychic energy needed to sustain that effort. The second cat, arriving during this intense period, received almost no support from the start and succumbed very quickly.
What about the dog, Misha? He was older, died of kidney failure. How did the emotional environment play into that?
Seth acknowledges Misha's illness was already incipient, meaning it was starting. They probably couldn't have kept him alive indefinitely anyway. However, the intense emotional stress in the household significantly accelerated the crisis. And Seth adds another layer here. He says animals, much like people, can sense when they're perceived as a burden.
Wow.
Yeah. Misha apparently sensed he was becoming a nuisance because the couple's stress made it harder for them to cope with his age-related needs. That feeling of being a burden, combined with the overall lack of psychic reinforcement from his humans, was enough, Seth says, to tip the balance physically.
That's incredibly sad. And this section also includes that specific, almost painful detail about an external negative influence linking the timing of the animal deaths partly to Joseph's mother.
It does. It's a really pointed comment. Seth specifically notes the deep resentment Jane was feeling towards Joseph's mother right around the Thanksgiving period, just before the animals passed. And Seth says, and this is heavy stuff, the strong negative suggestions given by her actually represented a turning point, and not a good one. The suggestion acted upon you and Jane, as well as upon the dog.
So the mother's negative emotions, or maybe things she said or implied, acted like a kind of psychic toxin, which was then absorbed by Jane and Joseph, who were already vulnerable and then somehow even affected the dog.
That's the chain of contagion Seth lays out. You have the external emotional toxicity coming in. It's the internal self-imprisonment, Joseph's ego hammer, Jane's related stresses. This leads to a critical drain on their available psychic strength. And the result, tragically, is the physical collapse of the dependent life forms around them who relied on that strength.
This brings us back to that chilling idea about viruses and illness in general. Seth says viruses are just struggling small fragments without intention of harm. They're always present. How does giving tacit agreement actually translate into becoming biologically vulnerable? Is this purely energetic, or does it cause actual chemical changes?
Seth seems to be describing it primarily as a fundamental energy state. Yes, viruses are fragments of life, they exist, but their ability to cause harm isn't inherent in them. It's predicated on the host's susceptibility, on the state of the host's energy field. Immunity in this framework isn't just about antibodies, it's about the overall strength and integrity of your energetic being.
So tacit agreement isn't like saying, okay, virus, come on in.
No, not a conscious thing at all. It's an energetic agreement. When Joseph and Jane were deeply stressed, fearful, projecting those pseudo-realities of pain, they were effectively lowering their own energetic defenses, their overall integrity. It's like they inadvertently weakened their own psychic immune system, which then allowed these ever-present viral fragments to gain a foothold, organize, and inflict physical damage.
That really makes the need for personal emotional responsibility feel absolute. Like the health of your dog, the strength of your own boundaries against negativity, it all circles back to your ability to manage and maintain a healthy internal state.
Exactly. Seth points out that when they came back from a trip to Florida shortly before this, they were actively fighting off these nervous projections and inner chaos. They simply lacked the reserves, the energetic surplus needed to help Misha through his decline. And this is where dissociation comes back in as the practical tool. It's the mechanism Seth offers to consciously blot out those incoming negative suggestions, even the powerful ones coming from family, and to rebuild that essential internal strength.
Okay, section 5. Let's shift focus a bit now to the relationship between Jane and Joseph. Seth talks about them very specifically as a team, right? Like a functional unit where their individual strengths and weaknesses balance each other out.
Yes, he sees their partnership as absolutely essential, a study in complementary skills, really. Joseph provides the self-discipline and control, which Seth says is crucial for anchoring Rupert's incredibly powerful, sometimes overwhelming, strong intuitional abilities during the channeling process. He keeps things grounded.
And Ruburt Jane.
Conversely, Ruburt provides Joseph with the needed freedoms. She helps him build necessary confidence in your own intuitional powers, basically nudging him to overcome his heavy reliance on just pure, rational thought. She helps him loosen up those tight bonds he put on himself.
Which highlights that central contradiction in Joseph we talked about earlier. He had this deep intuitive connection, especially with nature, but he actively distrusted imagination and intuition in himself because he was afraid it would lead him astray.
And Seth traces that distrust right back to his childhood relationship with his mother. He states that Joseph developed such a fear of his mother's tendency towards exaggeration that led often to sheer, though unwitting, lies and dishonesty. That as a defense mechanism, he learned to deny the capacity of the imagination lest it also lead you into ways of deceit.
Wow. So he basically shut down his own artistic, imaginative impulses to guarantee he would never be unconsciously dishonest like he perceived his mother to be.
That seems to be Seth's analysis. His rigorous dedication to objective fact, to logic, was a shield built against that childhood trauma, and that directly explains why he struggles so much to trust his own powerful intuition, even when it's clearly serving him well.
And this is also why Seth says Ruburt Jane is actually the better leader in certain situations, especially dealing with Joseph's parents, because she learned dissociation earlier.
Exactly. Seth says it very plainly. Ruburt is dissociated to some degree as far as your parents are concerned. You can trust her intuition and judgment along these lines. Because Joseph is still too emotionally entangled, too close to the original source of that particular fear and trauma around his mother, Jane, having developed her own ways of managing difficult emotional input, is better equipped to navigate that specific relationship dynamic.
And Seth doesn't just say this stuff, he gives concrete examples, right? Cases where Jane's intuition, this might have seemed impractical to Joseph, turned out to be the better guide compared to his logical conclusions.
Yes, he provides specific instances to back it up. Real case studies from their life together.
Okay, let's detail those. What was the first one? Something about his parents and a trip to Florida.
Right. Apparently, Jane had repeatedly warned Joseph that his parents would not be as pleased to see you return from Florida as he supposed. Joseph, probably operating from a sense of logical filial duty, of course they'll be happy to see me, ignored her emotional reading of the situation. Seth confirms. Joseph was wrong, Jane was right.
Okay, what else? There was something about an apartment.
Yes, this was apparently earlier in their relationship. Seth reminds Joseph of a time when Jane had a very strong feeling that you should borrow money and get an apartment or flat or whatever you call it. It wasn't just a suggestion. Seth says she was vehement and in tears over this on one occasion.
Vehement and in tears. That sounds pretty dramatic.
It does, but Seth completely validates her intense intuition. He tells Joseph that her advice was the best advice you could have been given at that time and would have been far more practical in the long run than whatever logical choice they ended up making instead. It's that recurring lesson. The subconscious, when it's not blocked by fear, often provides the most practical path, even if it doesn't immediately make sense to the rational ego.
But it wasn't just Jane having all the good intuition, right? Seth also points out times when Joseph's intuition was spot on, especially when he let go of that fear-based logic.
Absolutely, it wasn't a one-way street. Seth specifically praises Joseph's own unspoken but strong advice that he gave to Jane during an incident when she apparently got carried away in Elmira at the radio station.
Unspoken advice, how does that work?
Seth suggests Joseph didn't need to articulate it logically. He just needed to hold and project a sense of stability, a counter-reality to whatever Jane was getting caught up in. And Jane intuitively picked up on it and heeded that unspoken direction. Seth affirms that this saved them both considerable pain. It shows they function best as a team when they trust that intuitive flow between them, regardless of who is speaking it, verbally or non-verbally.
And finally, the session kind of wraps up with these wonderfully, almost mundane, yet really significant little pieces of advice, these small things that act as signs that Joseph is actually starting to open up.
Yeah, the little details are often the most telling, aren't they? Joseph had apparently done this quick, spontaneous sketch of a tree right on Jane's kitchen wall. He called it fun, said it added a new dimension to their small room. Seth picks up on this seemingly random act and affirms it. That tree sketch is very nice, and it is also significant as far as your opening up is concerned.
So the sketch itself was physical proof that his creative energy was starting to flow more freely.
Exactly. It was a small, tangible manifestation of that inner shift towards freedom and spontaneity.
And then there's the advice about showing his paintings to his art instructor, Mr. Claus. That has a classic Seth touch.
It really does. He tells Joseph he should invite Mr. Claus over to see his paintings, and then he throws in this little pun. He may not be Santa Claus, but it will do no harm. It's lighthearted, but the underlying message is serious. The act of sharing his work, of inviting external feedback without being crippled by fear, is a necessary part of this whole process of liberation for Joseph.
Right. Opening up externally as well as internally. And the very last piece of light advice, it was a prediction for Ruburt, for Jane, about a habit she had.
Yes, a gentle reassurance regarding her smoking. Seth predicts that she will dispense with the habit in the very near future. He also notes that the habit was actually an uncharacteristic excess for Joseph, too, maybe implying they both used it as a coping mechanism during stressful times. The underlying point seems to be that as the inner self, the creative core, gains more freedom and clarity, the need for these kinds of external crutches and dependencies tends to just fade away naturally.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. Outro time.
Right. So to try and synthesize the sheer depth of Session 17 for you, the listener, the big takeaway is probably this. The ego isn't inherently bad, it's the tool. The real danger comes when that tool, the ego, gets hijacked by fear, by practical worry. That's when it transforms from a useful focusing lens into that hammer hitting you incessantly over the head.
And that fear-driven state isn't just mental torture. It actually forces the incredibly powerful subconscious mind to create those thickly dimensioned pseudo-realities of pain, which can lead to real illness and even that chilling emotional contagion that affects everyone around us, our partners, our families, even our pets.
Which makes the ultimate necessity, the practical solution, the conscious practice of what Seth calls dissociation. It's about intentionally unclogging the tool. And remember, this isn't about escaping reality. It's a practical act of restoring the natural, healthy hierarchy within yourself, allowing the subconscious back into the driver's seat.
And you can achieve that through different means, right? Focused physical practices like the yoga Seth suggested, or gentle auto-suggestion done in the right state of mind, or even just reconnecting with the non-fear-based reality of nature.
Exactly. And despite the really critical, intense assessment of Joseph's situation throughout the session, Seth's final message to him was actually incredibly encouraging. It validates the power of doing this inner work. He tells Joseph, "You have been making great strides. The increased freedom of your subconscious mind will give you added energy and personal practical solutions far more beneficial than you would have dreamed possible."
That's a powerful promise. And of course, we have to sign off with that perfect, humorous instruction that kind of set the whole quirky tone for this deep dive right at the beginning. Give old Malbatos some butter and tell her I'm crustier than she is.
Classic Seth. Well, thank you for joining us on this exploration of Session 17. The Seth Material, as you can tell, is just such a profound and layered body of work.
It really is. And we absolutely must credit the Seth Material and the publisher, New Awareness Network, for making these incredible texts available for all of us to study. We really strongly encourage you, if this sparked your interest, to explore the original books yourself. You can visit the New Awareness Network website and their bookstore. That's at https://sethcenter.com, the early sessions, to continue your own deep dive.
So maybe a final provocative thought for you to consider, building directly on those profound, maybe slightly unsettling lessons about emotional contagion. If our inner emotional state really is powerful enough to unintentionally compromise the health and well-being of those around us, just imagine the constructive power, the reinforcing strength it holds when it's fully freed, focused, and operating from a place of confidence instead of fear.
So the question for you is, what simple, maybe even tiny, intentional act of dissociation can you implement today? Maybe it's just 5 minutes of conscious breathing. Maybe it's sketching a silly tree on your kitchen wall. Who knows? Something to just begin or continue unclogging your own unique creative engine.
Something to think about.
Until next time, keep digging deeper.